They brought in cranes from 3 different states, steel cables thick as your arm, 24 men who'd moved monuments twice its size. And yet, after 70 years, the statue of the Black Madonna on Sanctuary Rise didn't move, not even an inch. Some say it's a miracle, others say it's a curse. It stands on the highest point of Haven Creek, Delmarva, a quiet, overlooked town surrounded by rolling fields and maple-lined back roads. From miles away, the white marble figure of the Black Madonna can be seen, arms open, eyes lowered, as if she's been watching the town's every sunrise and every storm since the day she arrived. To the townspeople, she's not just a statue. She's a sentinel, a promise carved in stone. They've brought their joys, their griefs, their newborns, and their dying to her feet. And for generations, they've whispered one unspoken truth. You don't touch the lady on the hill. No one remembers exactly who placed her there. At least not the same way. To old Beatrice O'Neill, it was the Irish immigrant family who returned from the war with nothing but faith and a debt to God. To Pastor James, it was the parish priest, back when the town still had daily mass and every man in the county wore a suit to church. And to the teenagers who sneak up there on summer nights, she's just always been there, like the hill itself. But those stories, however different, all lead back to one belief. The lady chose this spot, and she's staying. Then came the plans, the glossy brochures, the city council meetings behind closed doors. The proposal had an elegant name: Haven Creek Spiritual Retreat and Resort, the vision to bring faith-based tourism to a struggling town. In small print, so small most people missed it at first, was a single line: relocate existing statue to accommodate new access road. The leaks started in whispers at Dave's Diner over black coffee. By Friday, every shop on Main Street was talking. By Sunday, Father Craggy couldn't get through Mass without catching the sharp, restless eyes of his parishioners. Half the town saw a chance to pull themselves out of decades of economic decline. The other half felt a cold dread, the kind you can't quite explain, only that it's the kind you get when you know something sacred is about to be violated. And then the stories began. First, the architecture student who came to measure the base said he dreamed the statue fell, not onto the ground, but onto his own blueprints. Next, a contractor from Cincinnati slipped on the first step leading up to the statue and broke his wrist, even though the stone was bone dry. Then came the rumors about the bell. Several residents swore they'd heard it, an old bronze church bell, tolling once, deep and slow. Though there's never been a bell on Sanctuary Rise, by the time the first crane rolled into town, a small crowd had already gathered at the base of the hill. They didn't hold signs or shout. They just stood, hands in pockets, gazes fixed upward. Some prayed under their breath. Some stared hard at the statue, as if daring it to blink. Even those who wanted the resort built felt uneasy. It was one thing to talk about moving the statue. It was another to watch men hook cold steel to her shoulders. That morning, the wind came from the east, carrying the scent of rain that never fell. Somewhere in the crowd, Beatrice O'Neill crossed herself and murmured the same line she'd said for 70 years. Ever since the day she'd placed a chipped piece of limestone at the statue's base. If you save us, we'll keep you here forever. Most people didn't hear her, but those who did, they'd remember it because what happened next would change how this town and far beyond looked at Sanctuary Rise forever. No one in Haven Creek agrees on every detail of how the lady came to stand on Sanctuary Rise, but certain fragments passed down through families, whispered in kitchens, retold at church potlucks, form a story that has outlived the people who first spoke it. The year was 1949. America was still catching its breath after the war. The town was smaller then. Just a cluster of clapboard houses, one general store, a post office the size of a tool shed, and the old St. Brendan's church at the bottom of the hill. That winter, a storm unlike any they'd seen in decades rolled across Delmarva. Heavy rain, ice, and wind, strong enough to snap power poles in half. On the third night, the Ohio River swelled to the edge of its banks, and the town's people braced for a flood that could wipe out everything. And then, without warning, the wind shifted. The storm's path bent, skirting the hill entirely. The floodwaters receded as quickly as they had risen. Some called it luck. Others called it something else. Among them was Patrick O'Connell, a veteran of the Pacific, and his wife, Eileen. The storm had hit on the very day they received word that their youngest son, declared missing in action in Okinawa, was alive and coming home. For them, it wasn't coincidence. It was a sign. Eileen told her neighbors that night, over a pot of beef stew, still simmering on the stove. We owe her a promise. She saved our boy, and she saved this town. We'll keep her here where everyone can see her watching over us. By spring, plans were quietly forming. There were no permits, no committees, no architects, just men with shovels and women with casseroles to feed them. Children hauled buckets of gravel up the dirt path, slipping in the mud but laughing all the same. The marble itself came from a quarry 2 counties over, a slab donated by a Catholic parish that couldn't afford to finish its own renovations. An out-of-work stonecutter named Carlo Mancini, who'd once carved saints for basilicas in Chicago, took the job for free. He worked in silence for weeks in an open-air shed at the foot of the hill. His only company the sound of chisel striking stone. Locals say he prayed under his breath with every cut, though no one could make out the words. When the statue was finished, the Black Madonna in flowing robes, eyes downcast, arms open, the entire town turned out to see her, placed on the hilltop. It was just after dawn. Men carried her in pieces up the slope, fitting them together like a sacred puzzle. The base was packed with stones donated by each family, a piece of their land, their hearth, their history. Somewhere under all that, Eileen O'Connell slipped a folded piece of paper into the foundation. No one knew what it said until decades later, when the wind and rain wore the mortar thin enough to reveal the edges of that paper. If you save our town, we'll keep you here forever. Over the years, the lady on Sanctuary Rise became more than stone and marble. She became a fixture in every life story. High school seniors came here the night before graduation, leaving corsages and notes about their futures. War widows sat on the stone steps when the weight of their loss grew too heavy. Farmers left baskets of corn and apples in the fall for her blessing. And then there were the strange moments no one could quite explain. A single candle burning through an entire night in January without a hint of wax dripping. A hawk that circled the hill for 3 days straight, then vanished. A little girl who wandered off during a summer picnic and was found 2 hours later at the base of the statue, safe, dry, and smiling, though the searchers swore they had combed that exact spot. Whether miracle or myth, the stories wove themselves into the fabric of Haven Creek. So much so that by the time outsiders began talking about moving the statue, it felt less like a public works decision and more like someone suggesting the town cut out its own heart. Ask the older folks and they'll tell you the lady has been here longer than the street lamps. Longer than the paved road into town. Longer even than some of the trees on the hill. Ask the younger ones, and they might shrug until you watch them walk past the statue and notice almost unconsciously the way they glance up just to make sure she's still there. Because in Haven Creek, faith isn't always shouted from the pulpit. Sometimes it's carved in stone, standing against the wind on a hill that refuses to give her up. It started quietly, the way most storms do in small towns, behind doors that the average resident never walks through. In the brick municipal building on Main Street, under the hum of fluorescent lights, the Haven Creek City Council met for what was described on the agenda as a special planning session. The public wasn't invited. Inside a slideshow clicked through renderings of a gleaming new project, Haven Creek Spiritual Retreat and Resort. On the screens, Sanctuary Rise had been transformed. The dirt path became a paved drive lined with ornamental cherry trees. A glass-walled visitor center stood at the summit, and at the edge of the property near the parking lot sat the statue of Our Lady, her white marble almost glowing under the artist's digital sunlight. It was the first time in over 70 years that anyone in a position of authority had suggested moving her. To the council and the development team, it made perfect sense. Accessibility, visibility, convenience for tour buses. To them, the lady was a piece of history worth preserving, just in a better spot. But that single decision, buried in the footnotes of a glossy proposal, would become a match to dry timber. The first to hear about it wasn't a council member or a journalist. It was a part-time clerk at the planning office, a young mother named Lisa Torres, who spotted the relocation line while scanning documents for filing. She told her aunt over breakfast the next day. By that evening, the news was halfway around town. At Dave's diner, the regulars leaned across the counter to whisper. At the grain co-op, old farmers paused their coffee break to shake their heads in disbelief. No one had seen it coming, yet somehow everyone had always feared it might. The reactions were split, but not in the way outsiders might expect. Some saw opportunity. "This place is dying," muttered Frank DeWire, owner of the auto shop, wiping his hands on a rag. A resort like that could bring jobs, bring life back to Main Street. Others felt a chill crawl up their spine. "You move her, you move the blessing," said Ruth Kelly, who still walked up the hill every Friday with a bundle of lilies, and when the blessing leaves, nothing good follows. By Sunday Mass, the divide was impossible to ignore. On one side of the church steps, younger couples talked about property values, about the chance to get their kids into better schools with the extra tax revenue. On the other, older parishioners clutch rosaries a little tighter, their eyes scanning the hill in the distance, as if to check that the lady was still there. Pastor Brennan heard both sides and kept his counsel, though he lingered longer than usual at the altar rail after service, his lips moving in a prayer no one could hear. And then there were the fence-sitters, those who didn't know what to believe, but couldn't shake the feeling that the town was stepping onto thin ice. In the evenings, the talk spilled into front yards and kitchen tables. A group of teens hanging out near the baseball field argued whether moving the statue would break the spell or whether it was just a rock. At the nursing home, Beatrice O'Neill, who'd been there the day the lady was placed, told anyone who'd listened that promises made to heaven weren't meant to be rewritten. The tension wasn't loud. It was simmering. No protests, no picket signs, just a subtle shift in how people looked at each other across the grocery aisle. Then came the first gesture of defiance. One Tuesday evening, a small group, 8 people at most, walked the path up Sanctuary Rise with candles in hand. They knelt at the statue's base, their flames flickering in the wind. They didn't speak, didn't chant. They simply stayed until the wax burned low, then left without a word. By the next night, the group had doubled. Within a week, there were 30 people on the hill praying under the open sky, And yet, no one called it a protest. It was quieter than that, more certain. Meanwhile, the developers sent in surveyors, men in polos and baseball caps with clipboards and laser measures. They walked the slope, took photographs, asked questions like, when was this foundation poured, and any record of a permit for this. Those questions made the townspeople bristle. No one had ever needed a permit to pray. It was during one of those visits that a surveyor approached Ruth Kelly, still standing with her lilies. "Ma'am, do you know if there's any documentation for how this statue got here?" he asked. Ruth just smiled thinly. "Yes," she said. "It's written in stone," and she walked away. Word of that exchange spread almost as fast as the news of the relocation itself. The town was now split into two clear camps. The first, mostly younger business owners and newcomers, argued that change was necessary. That sentiment alone couldn't keep a town alive. The second, rooted in families who'd been there for generations, insisted that not all value could be measured in dollars. And in the middle of it all, Sanctuary Rise stood untouched. The lady's gaze remained fixed on the town below, arms open, marble face serene, as if she'd seen this kind of struggle before, and knew exactly how it would end. But beneath that stillness, something was shifting, subtle as a breeze before a storm. The kind of shift that makes people glance over their shoulders on an empty street. The kind that tells you whatever happens next will not be ordinary. The first sign came to a man who didn't believe in signs. Tyler Grant was a senior architecture student interning with the development team. His job was simple: measure the base of the statue, take photos, and submit a draft for the proposed relocation platform. On his second morning in Haven Creek, he hiked up Sanctuary Rise with a tablet in one hand and a half-empty latte in the other. It was an unremarkable day, mid-September, warm sun, a few clouds drifting lazily overhead. He crouched, ran the laser measurer along the edge of the pedestal, and muttered about sloppy original work. Later that night, in the motel room the developers had booked for him, Tyler dreamed of the statue falling forward, not crumbling, but toppling in one impossible solid piece. It crashed down directly onto the plans he had printed earlier that evening, shattering the paper into dust. When he woke, the clock read 3:33 a.m. The dream left his shirt damp with sweat, his chest tight, as if the air in the room had been thinner than it should be. By the next morning, Tyler asked to be reassigned to a downtown survey site. He didn't explain why. The second sign wasn't as subtle. 2 days later, a contractor from Cincinnati named Bill Parsons came to inspect the slope for equipment placement. Bill had worked on heavy lift projects for 30 years, moving everything from Civil War cannons to granite memorial arches. On the hill's first step, a broad slab of limestone, worn smooth by the decades of weather. His boot slid out from under him. The stone was dry as bone, but he went down hard, fracturing his wrist. "That's just bad footing," the foreman told reporters later. But those who'd been there swore the air had turned colder in that moment, just for a breath, and that every bird in the nearby maple grove went silent. Then came the bell. It was a Friday evening, still light enough to see the lines of the hills to the west. Ruth Kelly was arranging lilies at the base of the statue when she heard it. 3 slow tolls from somewhere above her head. The sound was deep, metallic, and it seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have. She glanced up, half expecting to see someone holding a portable speaker as a joke. But there was nothing. No bell, no tower, just the open sky and the faint smell of rain, though no storm was anywhere in sight. By Sunday, a half-dozen others claimed they'd heard it too. Always in threes, always at dusk, The oddities kept coming. Pastor Brennan, normally not one to share personal visions, confided to a colleague in Louisville that he'd woken in the night to see a faint blue light moving slowly around the statue. It wasn't the jittery glow of a flashlight or phone. It drifted, steady and circular, then winked out when he stepped closer to the window. Teenagers who went up the hill for late-night dares came back quiet, reluctant to talk. One boy finally admitted he'd seen a woman in white standing a few feet from the statue, her hair moving in the wind, even though the air was still. At the nursing home, Beatrice O'Neill, too frail now to climb the hill, told her nurse that the lady had closed her eyes in a dream she'd had 3 nights in a row. Some of these accounts could be explained away, or so the developers argued. Optical illusions, overactive imaginations, the brain's tendency to connect dots where none exist. But explanations didn't stop the undercurrent of unease that spread through Haven Creek. The unease deepened when weather itself seemed to behave strangely on the hill. On an unseasonably warm October afternoon, the surveying crew reported sudden gusts of icy wind that rattled their measuring poles and knocked over clipboards. Just 50 yards down the slope, the air was still and warm. One morning, a young mother named Jaime Russell carried her 2-year-old up the hill to place flowers for her late grandfather. Halfway up, the boy began to giggle and point at the empty space beside the statue. "Lady's hand," he said. Jaime thought nothing of it until she realized his small palm was warm, as if someone had been holding it, though the air around them felt cool. That night, she told her husband, who told his brother, who told 3 more people at the bar. By the weekend, the story was all over town. And yet, for all the murmurs and warnings, the official project timeline didn't change. Developers insisted the relocation would proceed on schedule. Local officials framed the incidents as coincidences, but the workers on the ground began to hesitate. A crane operator named Gus, who'd spent most of his career lifting bridge spans across state lines, admitted to a friend at the hardware store that he'd started having headaches every time he set foot on the hill. "Not like normal headaches," he said, rubbing his temple. "Feels like someone standing right behind me. Just staring." Even those who wanted the project to happen began to admit quietly that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't worth tempting whatever forces seemed to be stirring. One night, without any organized plan, nearly 40 townspeople gathered at the foot of the hill. Some carried candles, others just stood with hands in their coat pockets, watching the statue. They didn't speak, but the silence was so complete that they could hear the distant rush of the creek a half-mile away. And then, faint but undeniable, 3 slow tolls of the bell rolled down the slope. Someone gasped. Someone else whispered, "She's warning us." No one moved for nearly a full minute. Later, when asked what they thought the warning meant, the answers varied. That we shouldn't move her. That something bad will happen if we do. That maybe it's already too late to decide. But whatever the meaning, the feeling was the same in every answer. The lady on Sanctuary Rise was no longer just watching over the town. She was speaking to it without a single word. And the town, whether it liked it or not, was beginning to listen. The first attempt came on a crisp Monday morning in late October. The sun rose clear, the air still, and from a distance, Sanctuary Rise looked unchanged, quiet, almost indifferent. But at its base, the scene was anything but ordinary. 2 freighted trucks idled beside a crane the size of a 3-story building. Steel cables coiled like snakes on the ground. Men in hard hats moved with the clipped precision of people who had done this 100 times before. To the crew, It was just another job. To the people of Haven Creek, it was the moment they'd been dreading. By 8 a.m., a small crowd had formed at the bottom of the slope. No signs, no shouting, just silent witnesses. Some clutched coffee cups, others rosaries. A few stood with arms folded, faces unreadable. The foreman barked orders. Cables were slung over shoulders and hauled up the hill. Workers secured them around the statue's base, checking the knots twice. From a purely engineering standpoint, it should have been simple. The marble weighed just under 2 tons, well within the crane's capacity. At 8:27, the crane's engine roared to life. The cable tightened, the boom arm lifted, and the statue didn't move. The operator frowned, eased the controls back, then increased the pull. The steel groaned, the tension gauge climbed, and with a sharp snap, one of the main cables whipped free, slamming into the dirt. A laborer stumbled backward, narrowly missing a fall down the slope. The foreman cursed, ordered the site shut down for inspection, and told the crowd they'd be back the next day. The second attempt was less public. On Tuesday, just after dawn, the crew returned with new cables, heavier than before. They brought in a winch truck in addition to the crane. The plan was to lift and pivot the statue onto a waiting flatbed. This time there were fewer onlookers, just a handful of townspeople who'd gotten the word of the unannounced start. Once again, the cables were fastened, the signal given. The winch motor growled, the crane tilted slightly forward under strain, but the statue stayed rooted. The only thing that moved was the winch truck, its tires sinking an inch into the earth, as if something was pulling back. The operator cut the power. A few workers exchanged uneasy glances, muttering about dead weight and bad footing, though the ground was dry and solid. By the third attempt, the developers were growing impatient. Thursday morning, they arrived with reinforcements, another crane, a larger crew, and a lowboy trailer reinforced for heavy loads. The plan now was to excavate around the base, free the foundation, and then lift. The backhoe started first, its bucket biting into the earth beside the pedestal. 10 inches down, the machine began to rattle violently. The operator swore he felt the bucket kick back like it had struck something alive. Seconds later, a loud crack split the air, and the hydraulic arm froze mid-motion. A thin stream of hydraulic fluid hissed onto the dirt, pooling at the operator's boots. Work stopped again. Tools were checked, parts replaced. Nothing in the mechanism explained the sudden failure. By now, rumors were running faster than the machines. People whispered about the 3:33 a.m. dreams, the tolling bell, the cold wind that never reached the town below. The fourth attempt never made it past setup. Saturday morning, the crew was halfway through securing the lift straps when the weather shifted. No clouds, no warning. Just a gust of air so sharp it sent paper plans tumbling down the hill like startled birds. Helmets rattled on heads. A few workers stepped back from the statue, swearing the wind felt colder than ice water. "Let's just get it done," the foreman shouted. They never got the chance. Without thunder, without any hint of rain, a single bolt of lightning struck the ground less than 15 feet from the base of the statue. The sound was deafening, the flash blinding. One man dropped to his knees, hands over his ears. Another fell backward, unharmed, but pale. The foreman radioed the operator. "Shut it down now." By that afternoon, the heavy equipment was being loaded back onto trailers. The developers issued a short statement to the local paper, citing unexpected technical issues and promising to review safety protocols before resuming work. But everyone on the hill that week knew better. Among the crew, no one wanted to be the one to try again. One crane operator asked to be reassigned out of state. A welder quit on the spot, and still the statue remained exactly as it had been. Arms open, gaze lowered, the marble surface unmarked, as if the steel cables had never touched her. The townspeople didn't celebrate. There were no cheers, no triumphant speeches, only quiet nods between neighbors, and a few more candles left burning at her feet. One evening, Ruth Kelly walked the slope alone, a bouquet of lilies in her arms. She stopped a few feet from the base, bent down, and brushed dirt from the edge of the foundation. Then she whispered something no one else could hear. Those who saw her said she smiled faintly as she walked back down the hill. Whether that smile meant relief or a warning depended on who you asked. When the calls started coming in from Haven Creek, most news outlets brushed them off as small-town drama. But not the Courier-Ledger, a regional paper in Louisville known for its human interest pieces. That's how Brad Cole entered the story. At 28, Brad was still considered the kid in the newsroom. Sharp, ambitious, but skeptical to the bone. He'd built a reputation on dismantling urban legends, haunted houses that turned out to be mold-infested, miracle cures that were nothing more than rebranded supplements. When his editor slid a thin file across the desk, 3 printed emails, a handful of cell phone snapshots of Sanctuary Rise, Brad raised an eyebrow. "A statue they can't move," he said. "You want me to cover that?" The editor leaned back. "I want you to find the truth. Write it up. Kill the myth. That's your specialty, isn't it?" Brad drove into town on a Thursday afternoon. A navy button-down rolled at the sleeves, sunglasses tucked into his collar, a camera bag in the passenger seat. He expected a sleepy place clinging to a relic, desperate for attention. What he found was quieter and heavier than he'd imagined. The main street was lined with brick storefronts, some boarded, some still open. People moved slowly, eyes shifting toward the hill, almost without realizing it. The statue, visible from half a mile away, seemed to anchor the horizon. His first interviews were polite but guarded. At Dave's diner, a waitress named Carla poured his coffee and answered questions with half smiles. "You can write whatever you want, hun," she said, "but don't make fun of her." At the grain co-op, a retired farmer offered a similar warning. "Believe it or don't, just don't mock the lady. That never ends well." No one tried to convince him of miracles. No one shoved photos in his face. It was as if the entire town had decided their job wasn't to convert him, just to make sure he understood the boundaries. That first night, Brad checked into the only motel in town. He reviewed footage he'd taken of the hill from various angles. At minute 7 of the second reel, something flickered behind the statue. White, fast, almost like fabric catching light. He froze the frame, zoomed in. It could have been glare, could have been nothing. The next morning, he climbed Sanctuary Rise alone. The air was cool, the grass damp. He stood at the base of the statue, notebook in hand, jotting down details. Weathered marble, faint chisel marks along the robe's folds, a hairline crack at the base that seemed to run deeper than it should. Halfway through his sketch notes, an elderly woman in a wool coat appeared at his side. "You're the reporter?" she said, not asked. Brad nodded. "What will you write about her?" "Still figuring that out," he replied. She studied him for a long moment, then said, "Don't write to prove, write to listen. The lady doesn't need defending. She just needs understanding." And with that, she walked down the hill without another word. That night, Brad planned a drone flight to capture aerial shots of the statue. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, low wind. But 15 seconds into the ascent, the live feed froze. The drone's battery reading dropped from 86% to 0 in an instant, and the machine fell out of the sky. When he reached it, Nothing was broken, except for the inexplicable fact that the battery now read full. He didn't sleep well. At 3:33 a.m., a sound pulled him from bed, not loud, but deep, like a bell heard through water. He stepped to the window. Sanctuary Rise was barely visible in the moonlight, but the statue's silhouette was unmistakable, standing as it had for 70 years. By the fourth day, Brad stopped trying to fit the town's unease into neat journalistic boxes. He still took notes, still shot video, but his questions changed. Less about the mechanics of moving marble, more about why no one wanted it moved. He found himself walking the hill in the late afternoons, staying until the light thinned into blue. Sometimes others were there, lighting candles or leaving flowers. Sometimes it was just him and the statue. The skepticism hadn't vanished, but it was shifting, replaced by a feeling he couldn't yet name. A sense that there was more to this place than folklore, and more to the lady than stone. And whether he liked it or not, he was beginning to feel like part of the story. It was Carla the diner, waitress who told Brad where to find her. "Last house on Willow Lane," she said, refilling his coffee. "White porch, rocking chair. If anyone knows the truth about the lady, it's Mrs. Beatrice O'Neill." Martha was 91, her frame slight, but her gaze steady. She sat on that porch like she'd been carved there, wrapped in a knitted shawl, watching the hill the way some people watch the ocean. When Brad arrived, she didn't ask who he was or why he'd come. She just gestured to the empty chair beside her. "You want to know where she came from?" she said. Not a question. He nodded. Martha's eyes shifted toward Sanctuary Rise, and for a long moment, she didn't speak. The wind stirred the hem of her shawl. "It was the winter of '49, she began, her voice low but clear. "We didn't have much in Haven Creek back then. No paved roads, no grocery store, barely enough to fill the church on Sundays. But we had each other, and we had that hill. Folks said it was the highest point in the county, and on clear days you could see the river glinting 30 meters off. That January, a storm came that should have drowned them. Days of rain, ice thick enough to crack tree limbs, wind that howled like it was tearing the sky apart. The river rose fast, too fast, and everyone knew it was only a matter of hours before it spilled over." Martha leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped. And then, just like that, it stopped. Wind shifted, water dropped, and the storm rolled east. The next morning, you could walk to the edge of town and see where the flood had been heading, straight for us before it turned away. She paused, letting the memory settle between them. People called it luck, but not Eileen O'Connell. Eileen and her husband Patrick were one of the few Irish immigrant families in town. Their son had just come home from the war, alive, after months listed as missing. The night the storm turned, Eileen told anyone who'd listened that they owed the Blessed Mother a promise. "If you saved our boy and you saved our town," she said, "then we'll keep you here forever." It didn't take long before the promise became a plan. No permits, no fundraising drives, just neighbors hauling stone and timber up the slope. A stonemason named Carlo Mancini, out of work, out of options, took the job for free. "He was an artist," Martha said softly. Didn't talk much, but when he carved her face, it was like he already knew her. The statue went up in the spring. The whole town gathered at the base. Men in Sunday suits, women in dresses, children holding whatever flowers they could find. Every family brought a single stone to place into the foundation, a piece of themselves beneath her feet. And then, when no one was looking, Eileen slipped a folded piece of paper deep into the wet mortar. Martha saw her do it. She didn't tell anyone what it said. Not for decades. The years passed. Crops failed and grew again. Children left for the cities. The church steeple was replaced twice. The lady remained through snow and heat and hail. She never seemed to wear. Then one summer, a corner of the foundation crumbled just enough to show the edge of something pale and brittle. Martha, already in her 70s, brushed away the dust. It was the paper, still folded, still intact. We didn't open it right away. It didn't feel right. But Eileen, she was in her final days, and she asked for it. The letter was simple. A single sentence in Eileen's careful hand. "If you save our town, we will keep you here forever." When Brad asked what happened to it, Martha's lips curved into a faint smile. It's still there, right where she put it. You can't see it now, but you don't have to. The lady remembers. For a while, neither of them spoke. Down the street, a pickup rumbled past the driver, lifting 2 fingers and greeting without slowing. Martha finally turned to him. "You came here looking for a story you could explain," she said. "But this one isn't about explanations. It's about a promise. And promises like that, they don't break easy." Brad glanced toward Sanctuary Rise, the statue catching the late light. From where he sat, it looked less like carved marble and more like something alive. Listening, and for the first time since he arrived, he wasn't sure which version of the story he believed. The order came down on a Monday morning, crisp and bureaucratic. Proceed with relocation, it read. No qualifiers, no delays. By Thursday, a Sanctuary Rise no longer looked like a hilltop. It looked like a staging ground. 3 cranes loomed against the sky, their arms jutting over the ridge like siege towers. Flatbeds lined the access road. A dozen men in bright vests moved between coils of cable and stacks of lumber, their radios spitting bursts of static. It was the largest crew the town had ever seen. They'd brought in specialists from Nashville, from Chicago, people who moved longhouses and relocated Civil War monuments. To them, this was just another job. To the people watching from the base of the hill, it felt like an invasion. By 8 a.m., a crowd had gathered. No one shouted. No one waved signs. They just stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed on the summit where the white statue rose above the machinery. The plan was simple on paper. Step 1, cut into the foundation and free the base. Step 2, lift the statue by crane onto a steel platform. Step 3, load onto a reinforced flatbed for transport to its new, more accessible location down by the highway. At 8:15, the first drill hit the foundation. From the base of the hill, the sound was a steady metallic whine, almost swallowed by the wind. But on the ridge, the men felt it differently. A vibration that shivered up through their boots, as if the ground itself was reluctant. By 8:20, the drill stalled, not jammed, not broken, just stopped. The bit refused to turn, though the motor roared at full power. Mechanics swarmed the rig, muttering about torque settings and electrical faults. The foreman called for the second drill. It ran for 12 seconds before its bits snapped clean in half. The crowd at the bottom shifted uneasily. The foreman decided to skip ahead, hook the crane directly, see if the statue would budge without freeing the base completely. Heavy nylon straps were looped under the lady's outstretched arms, secured with steel shackles big enough to anchor a boat. From his operator's seat, a man named Hal gave the thumbs up. The crane groaned, the straps tightened, and for the first time in 70-plus years, the statue moved a fraction of an inch, maybe 2. The crowd gasped, half in awe, half in dread. Then came the wind. It wasn't a storm wind. There were no dark clouds, no smell of rain. It was a cold, cutting gust from the west, sharp enough to sting exposed skin. The kind of wind that makes the air taste metallic. House swore in his cab. His controls flickered. The hydraulic pressure gauge dipping without reason. The crane shuddered. The straps went slack, and a sound like a low, resonant gong rolled down the hill. The workers froze. So did the crowd. It came again. 3 deep tolls, slow and deliberate. No bell stood on that hill. Yet the sound was real enough to vibrate in the ribs. Hal tried again, pushing the controls forward. The crane arm lifted half a foot before every alarm on the console lit up at once. Overload, hydraulic fault, power surge. The engine died in a cough of black smoke. The foreman barked for the backup crane. Its operator barely got the boom extended before the radio on his hip erupted in a screech of static. He yanked it off his belt. The casing was hot to the touch. Then lightning. A single bolt, white, blue, and blinding, split the sky and slammed into the ground 10 feet from the statue. There had been no thunderheads, no warning, just the sudden surgical strike. One of the men closest to the impact, an iron worker named James, was thrown backward. He landed hard but conscious, eyes wide, insisting that in the instant before he hit the ground, he'd felt a hand on his chest. A small hand, warm. The foreman didn't ask for another attempt. He ordered every machine powered down and every man off the hill. Down below, the crowd stood in the stunned silence. Some crossed themselves. Others simply stared as if trying to memorize the exact way the statue looked in that moment. Unmoved, unmarked, her marble face serene beneath a sky that was suddenly calm again. Within an hour, the hilltop was empty except for the lady. The cranes, the trucks, the crews, all gone, leaving deep tire marks in the grass and a few abandoned lengths of cable coiled like shedskin. By dusk, the only sound was the rustle of leaves. Candles began appearing at the base. 1, then 3, then a ring of flickering light around the pedestal. No one could say who started it. Later that night, as the town settled into uneasy quiet, an unseasonal rain swept through. 15 minutes of steady silver sheets that soaked the streets and shone in the glow of the hilltop candles. In the morning, everything was dry. The cables were gone. The cranes had been hauled away, and the lady still stood in the same place she had been since the spring of 1949, arms open, gaze lowered toward the town. The relocation project was not officially canceled. The developers never issued a formal statement, but the machinery never came back. Those who were there that day will tell you they saw a failed engineering job, nothing more. But if you ask the others, the ones who heard the bell toll, who felt the cold wind, who saw lightning fall from a clear blue sky, they'll say the lady on Sanctuary Rise made her answer plain. And it wasn't no, it was don't try again. After the final attempt, the hill went quiet. Not the kind of quiet you notice all at once, but the kind that grows day by day, until you realize something is missing. There were no more engines, no more shouts of men measuring and drilling, no more steel cables snaking across the grass, just whine through the maples, the soft crunch of boots from those who still climb the slope, and the occasional murmur of a prayer. The developers didn't hold a press conference. The city council didn't make an announcement. The relocation date simply vanished from the agenda, and the glossy posters for the Haven Creek Spiritual Retreat and Resort began to disappear from store windows one by one. To the townspeople, that silence spoke louder than any official statement. In the weeks that followed, life in Haven Creek began to settle back into its rhythm. But it wasn't the same as before. The people who had argued for the move no longer spoke about opportunity in quite the same way. Some avoided the topic altogether. Others, quietly and without fanfare, joined the evening walks up Sanctuary Rise. Ruth Kelly, who had brought lilies to the statue every Friday for decades, noticed something subtle but certain. More footsteps on the path. Not just the older generation, but young couples, teenagers, even children clutching their parents' hands. Some came with flowers. Some came with nothing but a few minutes to stand in the open air beside the lady. Even Brad Cole changed. The journalist who had arrived with the sharp confidence of a skeptic now carried a small notebook filled not with details, but with lines that read more like prayers. He never admitted to believing in miracles, but when asked why he was still in town weeks after his assignment ended, he would only say, "Some stories take longer to finish." He started attending the evening gatherings, not as a reporter, but as another quiet face in the circle. He lit candles, listened to the low hum of hymns, and learned the names of the people whose lives had been shaped in ways large and small by the lady on the hill. And though the relocation had been abandoned, Sanctuary Rise itself began to change, not in form, but in care. The dirt path was leveled and lined with gravel by volunteers. A small wooden table appeared at the base of the statue for flowers and handwritten notes. No one claimed credit for building it, but everyone used it. Even Beatrice O'Neill, too frail now to climb the hill, insisted her niece take her up once a month. She would sit in a folding chair at the base, her eyes never leaving the marble face. "It's not about winning," she told Brad one afternoon, her voice soft against the wind. "It's about keeping your word." The argument over the statue had divided the town, but in its quiet aftermath, something else had taken root. The hill became less of a landmark and more of a promise renewed, not just the O'Connell's vow from 1949, but a shared understanding that some things are kept, not because they're profitable, but because they're sacred. The lady didn't move, but the people did. Tourists began to hear the story. Sometimes from local shopkeepers, sometimes from a stranger in the diner, and a trickle of visitors came to see her. They didn't arrive in busloads. They came in pairs and families in ones and twos, often leaving as quietly as they'd come. And while some took photos, many just stood in stillness for a while, as though waiting to see if they'd hear the bell. One autumn evening, just before sunset, the entire hill seemed to glow under a wash of golden light. The candles flickered, the maple leaves swayed, and the white marble caught the last rays of the day. Brad stood among the crowd that had gathered, his camera untouched in its bag. In his notebook, he wrote a single sentence. "It's not that she couldn't be moved. It's that she shouldn't be." Down in town, the council chamber stayed quiet on the subject of Sanctuary Rise. The developers never returned. The project files were filed away, and in time, even the most ambitious among them stopped mentioning the resort. For Haven Creek, that was victory enough. And for the Black Madonna on the hill, it was simply another chapter in a long watch that had already spanned generations. Those who visit now don't talk much about lightning or wind or bells that toll from nowhere. They talk about the view from the top, about the stillness, about how if you stand there long enough, you can almost feel the town breathing beneath you. And maybe that's the real miracle. Not a statue that refuses to move, but a community that chose to stand still with her. So if you ever find yourself driving the back roads of Delmarva and see a glint of white marble above the tree line, pull over, take the walk, stand at her feet. You don't need to believe in miracles to understand why she's still there. You just need to listen. If you were moved by this story, give this video a like. Share it with someone who might need a moment of grace today. And subscribe to Healing Hand of Madonna so you won't miss the next story where faith, mystery, and the human heart